It's the most wonderful time of the year. What makes it so? Two things. Number one, wildcard weekend is squarely behind us, which means we are off into the NFL playoffs. Yes, it is a strange year. However, I'll take what I can get. And that is the National Football League for those of you not in the United States. Number two is this is the time of year when readers from around the world talk about their favorite books of 2020. Now, some readers go ahead and make that call in December and some as early as November. I wait until the very last minute because, as you will see, the very last book I finished in 2020 makes this list. So what we're going to be talking about today is the best books that I read in 2020. Jambo Rafiki, I'm Elizabeth from Kasiwa82, and I hope you are doing really well. If you're new to my channel, welcome, and if you've been here before, welcome back. It's time for the next bookish video since it's a TBR Tuesday, and what I'm talking about today is my favorite books that I read in 2020. The usual caveats apply. These are not books that were necessarily published in 2020, but the ones that I happen to have read and loved. Now, there'll be a stats video coming up shortly, but let me quickly go over the fact that I read 183 books last year. 183. Now, for me, that's a huge number. Before you get too excited, let's see, 88 of those were comics or graphic novels. So of the entire 183, 95 were actual books that were not comics in some format, okay? Like I said, I'll be coming up with a stats video fairly soon, so stay tuned for that. So let's go over the 12 books that I loved in 2020. It was an amazing year. I have a lot of 4-star reads, actually, which is unusual for me. But 12 books, I could not get it down to 10. I just couldn't. So I also could not rank these. So what I'm going to do is go over these books in the order that I read them in the year. Now, I don't have any of the books with me because they were all library books and have been returned. So I'm going to perform an experiment where I try and put up an image here of the book cover. We'll see how well that works out. So without much further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Number one, the first 5-star read of 2020 for me was The Force by Don Winslow. I listened to the audiobook, which is wonderfully narrated by Dion. Would highly recommend this on audio. I'm a huge fan of Don Winslow. He tends to write urban crime, gritty kinds of books, and this book is no exception. The Force is about Manhattan North. And so you're basically following the cops, the criminals, the justice system, the prostitute, the pimps, the drug dealers. As you can tell, very gritty. It is wonderfully written. The pace is propulsive. The dialogue is spot on. The characters, you feel like you know these people. And what the twist is here is what you're following is, this guy called Denny Malone, who is a dirty cop, and you are rooting for him every step of the way. Before you judge, get to the end of that book and see if you don't agree with some of the fact that why this guy is an anti-hero, but a hero really of this story. Highly recommend The Force by Don Winslow. And again, on audio, this is excellent. I don't know why I haven't read all these books. I've read one, The Power of the Dog, before, which is the first book in his trilogy of the Cartel. And I'm not sure why I never got around to it. So that'll be coming up this year as well. The second 5-star read for me this in 2020, I don't understand. So as a person who grew up in the British colonies, specifically Kenya, and my education was primarily British, how it is I have never read P.G. Woodhouse is something I don't quite understand. However, The Code of the Woosters. This is the one by P.G. Woodhouse. I listened again to the audiobook by Jonathan Cecil. It's a wonderful narration. This is the number 7 of the Jeeves series. However, I have not read any other Woodhouse, and so this was my entree into his particular Jeeves series, and it works pretty well as a standalone. There were a couple of references to things from earlier books, but nothing that really detracts from the story. What is the story about? I know. Do we really care about rich white people and their problems? Trust me, you do. And there is not a dead body to be found in this story. It's a mystery of hijinks, all centered around a cow creamery. I know, it sounds ridiculous. Trust me on this one, especially when this is the time around the time when we were beginning to hear about this pandemic coming down the pipe. I was like, I need something lighter and something funny. I laughed out loud during the shenanigans of this. You know, Bertie Wooster, you just want to hit him on the head with a saucepan, but kind of and then you alternate between wanting to hit him and giving him a hug. It's hard to explain. Highly recommend this one. It is hilarious. And again, really great on audio. The next book I have on the list this is a long title and I always get it wrong, so let me just look at my notes here. The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse by Charlie Mackesy. I do not know where this book came out of, and I did see that a couple of people that I know have also got it on their best of books that they read in 2020. It's hard to explain. It's not a comic, it's not a picture book, and it's not a novel. This is essentially an illustrated story of a young boy who meets some friends and kind of how his friends encourage him. It is a gentle story about working through things that you're scared of and finding friends that help you along the way. Beautiful all ages story, and I would actually highly recommend you get the actual book, because part of what's wonderful about this book are the illustrations. It's got a very inky, loose illustrative style that's beautiful. This is a book that when I got to the end of, I turned around and read it again right through, because it doesn't take very long, but it's got some nuggets that will really stay with you. So reading it to your young ones or your older loved ones, either or, this is one that I would highly recommend. And I think this is one that I can see reading again and again. As I said, it's just a wonderful, cozy, makes you feel good, uplifting kind of story. A boy and the animals he meets. I know, sounds strange. You will love it. Trust me. Pick up a copy. Okay. Moving on from fuzzy to something that is clearly not fuzzy is My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. Now, all the trigger warnings for this book, okay? So if you have read Nabokov's Lolita, this is essentially that story told from the girl's point of view in an updated modern context. It is breathtakingly well written. It's a debut novel, which I cannot believe. It is so well written. It is so dark. It is horrifying. You are in the mind of the characters, and I could not put this book down. So this is the story of 15-year-old Vanessa and this 42-year-old English teacher that she starts having a relationship with. His name is Strain. I can't remember his first name. Anyway, doesn't matter. The point of this story is the exploration of how it is a predator builds a relationship with a young child. That it is uncomfortable. I mean, I was uncomfortable the entire time I was reading this book, and yet the exploration is so well done, because you see that little steps you take, the little choices you make, and how suddenly you find yourself out in the woods by yourself. The author does not pull any punches. It is an unflinching look at what this kind of a situation would look like. And, you know, it takes on very much kind of the backlash of the Me Too movement, as well as just how girls get sexualized at a very young age. Some boys do too, but girls in general. There's this sexualization by older men of very young girls, because your bodies start to change in these very visible ways while your mind is still a kid. And so this exploration, I could not put this book down. Now, I listened to this on audio. It's wonderfully narrated by Grace Gummer. The one thing I will say about the audio is you cannot fast forward. Well, you could, but really it's harder to skim the difficult places, right? This is the sex is explicit. So if that is something you're not into, I would highly recommend staying away from this one. But if you're interested in actually understanding some of the dynamics between a young girl and her predator and how they look at this relationship, because remember, the girl does see this as a love story. The story starts with her as an older woman. So Vanessa, we meet her as an older woman, and then we go back in time and these two storylines merge. So Vanessa going into high school and meeting this instructor a year before that, and present day Vanessa, and the story kind of comes together. I cannot recommend this highly enough. I just, it's dark, it's uncomfortable, it will make you uncomfortable, but I think in a non-gratuitous way, because this happens with how we treat girls and women in all kinds of media on an everyday basis. And I think actually looking at that, while uncomfortable, is incredibly rewarding. Next up, which is number 5 on my list. So again, after that dark, I needed something lighter. And this is a play, The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. I listened to the audio of this play narrated by Allison, Larkin, and James Warwick. Highly recommend Oscar Wilde. I don't think I need to talk about Oscar Wilde here, but every time I feel as though books that are new or the buzzworthy books of a year disappoint me, I tend to go back and reach for the classics. And Wilde is one of those people who every single time I read him, he takes my breath away. His insight into human nature, his wit, his critique of humanity, he's just so clever and snarky and humorous. And really, there is not a wasted word in this play. Highly recommend this one. Actually, all of Wilde, but this is the one that I read last year that I loved. So that's the only play on this particular list. Next, I have The Dutch House by Anne Patchett. Again, I listened to the audiobook of this by Tom Hanks, who does the narration. Now, Anne Patchett is a hit or miss with me. I love some of her books, and I don't like others at all. Bel Canto was not a favorite of mine, and yet other ones of hers I have enjoyed. The Dutch House is my favorite of, I think, all of her books that I've read to date. It's the story of a family. It's a classic family drama, right? So when we think about domestic fiction, this to me is what should be used as the poster child for domestic fiction. It is fantastic. It is the story of a family where after the Second World War, the father makes an investment that actually moves the family out of poverty into extreme wealth. The father ends up, when his wife dies, marries another woman who then, when the father, let me just put, I don't want to spoil anything away. Basically what happens is the 2 kids of the original parents end up losing this house and the wealth and basically flip back into poverty. So in one generation, you go to wealth, extreme wealth, and the next generation, you're back to poverty. And it's how sometimes you cannot get over your past. It's the story of these 2 siblings who are caught by these memories of who they used to be as a family and what happened to them, especially when the mom disappears from the story. The relationship between these 2 siblings is fantastically fleshed out. The point of view we get completely is through the boy Danny, and I think it's just done really, really well in terms of really taking you down the path of what do family dynamics look like, what does wealth, how does it manifest, and how do families deal with them? Because it's not one monolith, right? Everyone deals with that differently. It deals with class, it deals with poverty, it deals with families that fracture and come back together again. I highly recommend this. Now, Tom Hanks was an interesting choice for the audiobook. I think he narrates it really well because Danny is the POV we follow. He's got some quirks that kind of took me out of the story that reminds me that Tom Hanks is doing the narration. However, highly recommend it. Overall, he does a really good job of narrating what is already a fantastic story. All right. Number 7 on this list, and again, I'm just going through the order I read them, is City of Thieves by David Benioff. Again, highly recommend this on audio. It is wonderfully narrated by Ron Pearlman. So David Benioff is the showrunner for the Game of Thrones. I have huge issues with him about what he ended up doing with that show, but that's not what we're talking about here. This book is, I think, autofiction or almost a fictionalized version of his father's story. It's set in World War II during the siege of Leningrad. And I have never read a war story like this. One, I don't tend to read, for the most part, I have not read war stories from the Russian POV looking out, okay? And 2, the story is told from the point of Lev, who is a very young boy, around 17 years old. He gets arrested, and instead of being put to death, he and this older guy who's about 20 years old, big philosophical thinker, are sent out on an errand. So it's a war story with a quest built in, right? And what they're looking for is a dozen eggs. I know, it'll make sense to you, but I highly recommend you listen or read this one because, again, it's a war story. So there's horror in this built into the premise, right? You don't have to know any more than that when you go in because you know it's a war story. What was unexpected is the humor, the philosophy, the explorations of what it means to be human. It's an exploration of love and friendship and finding light and beauty in the midst of horror. Could not recommend this highly enough. This has been on my TBR for years, and I'm always like, a war story, I don't know. Yes, I could not put it down. They are horrific things that happen, but the light is mixed in so beautifully. You come out of it without necessarily this overwhelming, depressing emotions, right? You actually see the light here. Highly recommend this. It's fantastic. Okay, number 8 is a nonfiction graphic novel called The Mars Challenge. It's written by Allison, Wilgus, and illustrated by Wyeth, Yates. Now, this graphic novel is written for a YA audience and I think would work equally well for anyone interested in the space program. It essentially takes a look and explores both the past, the current, present, and the future of the U.S. space program in specifically, even though it goes over the space program in general. And what would it take for us to get to Mars? The thing is, a lot of stories that have Mars exploration built into the sci-fi, it's, the story is, wave a magic wand and we get to Mars. And then what happens? The thing is, there are so many complex issues about how would we get to Mars? How do we return, right? If you're just planning on going one way, different problem. But let's assume you want to come back. What does that look like? It is incredibly well illustrated. The text is well done. It is a little text heavy. However, the science is not dumbed down at all, which I really appreciate. I also really like the fact that the story unfolds through 2 characters. We have a young girl who wants to be the first astronaut who gets to Mars. And she's being told about the space program and what it would take to get to Mars by another woman, both women of color. This is an older woman who actually is responsible for running the ISS, right, the International Space Station. So it's a perfect premise. You have an expert in the field talking to a young kid in the field who wants to be an astronaut and doesn't really know what she doesn't know. And it's a perfect way to kind of explore and go into the details of what is involved in A, how we got to space, what our space program has been to date, and B, what it would take to get there. Love it, highly recommend it, both for kids and adults, anyone interested in the space program in any capacity whatsoever, and or anyone interested in science. This is actually a fantastic graphic novel. Could not recommend this highly enough. Okay, we're down to the last 4. Number 9 is Packing My Library, an Elegy and 10 Digressions by Alberto Manguel. Now, this one, again, the audiobook is wonderfully narrated by James Cameron Stewart. It's a nonfiction memoir. So this book is set up as mini essays. The author is a bibliophile. So if you're a reader, you're going to love this one. And what happened, the premise of the story, or the premise of this memoir is that he's got this 35,000 collection library in a barn, I think it is, in France. They're packing it up to move to an apartment in Manhattan. So that process, anybody who's moved knows this, right? The moment you go back and you touch things, a lot of memories come up. And the author does a really great job of kind of exploring the history of the written word and books, the relationship between writer and reader, the relationship between books and collectors, and our memories and how they are so tied up to books that we read and stories that we tell, and how we find ourselves often in books that we read. I highly recommend this one. The author is an incredibly erudite and well-read person, and it felt like spending time with a really articulate friend as you were going for walks. So I listen to all my audiobooks when I'm walking, Now, I did not pick up every reference he mentioned because I am not as well read as the author by any stretch of the imagination, but I highly recommend this one. And this is another one I have no doubts that I'll be going back to, because I think the more you've read, when you think about the references he mentions, the more you'll get out of some of those essays. Highly recommend this one as well. Number 10 out of the 12, Pet Sematary. Stephen King and I have had this love-hate relationship. I've loved him, then I was like, I am not reading any more by this guy, and then I've gone back to, well, he's actually really good when he writes well. Pet Sematary is one of his older books, and I really love a lot of King's older books. It's a horror story. It's told, the premise is there's this family from Chicago moving to Maine. Pets on the road that they live on, that they move to, die, and they find out by their neighbor explores or tells them that there is this pet cemetery behind their house on their property, where kids over the years have gone and buried their pets. It's a horror story. You probably know the premise of this because the movies have been so popular. What I did not pick up the first time I read this, because I was much younger, is that this might be the best book about grief that I have ever read in fiction. And I think I was too young to understand and appreciate that at the time. It is really well written, well plotted. King, when he is good, he is outstanding. His characterization of these people, you feel like you know them. When they make the decisions they make, you understand why they make them. You are hoping that they don't make them, but you understand why they make those decisions. You are with them every step of the way. It's an incredibly tight plot. It's a slow-moving meditation of, those of you who are familiar with the monkey's paw, right? It's a slow-moving meditation on if you were given these choices, even though you're horrified at the decisions the people in the book make, can you really look in the mirror and think you would do anything different? I highly recommend this King. The Pet Sematary might be one of my top 5 King ever, and I've read a lot of his stuff. This is fantastic, and unlike a lot of King, he nails the ending in this one. It is superb. The audiobook is narrated by Michael C. Hall. Highly recommend. I read this during Halloween week, right before coming up to the elections of 2020. It was the perfect time to get lost in a story. I highly recommend. Fantastic. If you're a King and you want to read a King and you haven't read any King, this might be a good one to start with. Number 11 out of 12 is Stag Sleep. It is the only poetry collection in this book. I have had a rocky relationship with poetry just because I had a really bad teacher when I was in school, and have since been trying to add more poetry into my reading rotation. Stag Sleep is by Sharon Olds, and it won the Pulitzer Prize in 2013, and I can see why. This is... I just am blown away by what some writers can do. This collection is about the ending of a 30-year marriage. The author and her husband have been married for 30 years and has told her that he no longer wants to be married. It is an exploration of a relationship, the highs, the lows. We often say and it is well recognized, right? You don't ever know what is going on in somebody else's relations. Heck, in your own relationship, you only know 50% of it because there's somebody on the other end. Sharon Olds does this. One, her writing is sublime. She just takes you there. She also bears herself in a way with honesty that I find astounding. I don't know how someone can just be this open and just lay themselves bare for strangers to read about something so intimate and something that is so painful, right? She's the one being left here. It is a beautiful meditation on relationships, on love and family and loss and sorrow and grief and healing. I highly recommend this one. I read this really, really slowly. I read each poem twice. I would read it once and then I would go back and actually savor, because I now know what the poem's about, is that I would savor the words. And at the end of this one, I really had to go slowly because it's like a really good meal. It takes time to digest what she's telling you. And I highly recommend this one. If you're going to read one poetry collection this year, I'd recommend this one. And last but not least, which is why I never, ever do these reviews or make this compilation before the end of the year, is Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Now, I have a tradition where I read a Dickens every December. It's called my Dickens in December project, and I'm working my way through his novels primarily. This 2020 was my 6th year of doing that. And as much as I have heard about Dickens and I love him, I think he is a master craftsman. Little Dorrit is not a story that I've heard often talked about. So when one of my friends on Goodreads recommended this as one of her favorite Dickens, I said, well, time to move this up the list. She's not wrong. It's fantastic. How does one summarize Dickens? This is a massive book. It's, as usual, got a huge cast of characters. Every single character is incredibly well fleshed out. It's the story primarily of a family. The little Dorrit of the title, she's born in this prison called Marshalsea Prison, which is a debtor's prison. Now, I do know that Charles Dickens' father was also in that prison for debt. So there's a personal connection Dickens has to that particular prison as well, right? So it's the story of her and her family, and then all these peripheral characters around them that they connect with. Dickens is wordy, yes, but I'll tell you what, people who talk about how he gets paid by the word, I don't care. I would have read another 1,000 pages on top of this. I love his writing. I love his characterization of his characters. They are incredibly well fleshed out. They are so distinctive. Unlike a lot of characters or writers who do multiple POVs, you know when you're reading Dickens, even if you did not know if they gave you no name, you would know who that character is because of how they sound and how they speak. Very, very few authors can do what this man does when he comes to writing. I loved it. He takes you on these multiple tangents. They are people you love. They are people you hate. They are people you want to hit on the head with a frigging saucepan. But I would not miss a single moment. Everything connects in a way that is masterfully done. I have yet to read a Dickens that I have not loved. I mean, I think with the exception of 1 or 2, everything I've read of his gets 5 stars for me, and this is no different. I listened to this particular Dickens is narrated on audio, is narrated by Simon Vance, who is one of my top 10 audiobook narrators. So not only do I have this amazing book by Dickens, I have this incredible narration by Simon Vance. It's just fantastic. So that is why I wait until the very last day of December before I determine what my best books of the year are going to be. Little Dorrit, I completed, I think it was about between noon and 2 o'clock on December 31st. And if I had made this list sooner, it would not have made it. And what a tragedy that would be. I would highly recommend Dickens. He is really good. He is a master craftsman, as I said earlier. And I also find that a lot of classics work really well on audio. There's something about the way they're written that actually work really well something that you listen to as opposed to something that you necessarily read on print. So those are my favorite books of 2020. It's the top 12. I couldn't narrow it down any further. All of these 12 get 5 stars from me, and I tend to be pretty stingy with my 5 stars. There were a lot of great books I read this year, a lot of 4 stars. Like I said, it was a pretty good year all around. I will leave the list of all the books I've mentioned down below. I'd be curious as to what your favorite reads of the year were. Please let me know. And until I see you next time, happy reading. Bye.